from failing 3 times to launch their first rocket to building the world's most powerful rocket. The journey of SpaceX is one of the most fascinating ones in the aerospace industry. Today, they have a technology to complete every type of space mission. But do you know the history of this organization? So let's take a look at the success story of SpaceX. In 2001, Elon Musk conceptualized a project to land an experimental greenhouse on Mars and grow plants there. It was called the Mars Oasis. But as he needed rockets to do that, he went to Russia to buy refurbished ICBM missiles and just launched them into space with some modifications. But after going to Russia, he found that each one of them cost about $8 million, which was very costly. So he returned to USA and decided to make his own rocket at a much lower cost. On 6th May 2002, Elon Musk established SpaceX with the vision for making low-cost commercial rockets and settling humans on Mars. He started SpaceX with a funding of $60 million and worked for years to develop their first rocket, Falcon 1. And at this point, there comes a twist in the story. Between 2006 and 2008, SpaceX launched Falcon 1 3 times, but all of them failed badly. At that point, SpaceX and Elon Musk both went almost bankrupt. But Elon Musk still put all of his remaining wealth for the fourth launch. On 28 September 2008, SpaceX launched the Falcon 1 for the fourth time, and this time they succeeded. They became the first private space agency to launch a liquid-fueled rocket into the orbit. Shortly after the launch, NASA awarded SpaceX a massive $1.6 billion contract. By 2009, SpaceX started developing their next launch vehicle, Falcon 9. In June 2010, Falcon 9 was launched for the first time. It became the first rocket in the world which was reusable and could return back safely to Earth. NASA continued to issue multiple contracts with SpaceX through the years. These included the development of the Dragon capsule and the launch system for the launch of manned missions. By 2014, SpaceX began to capture the commercial market for space transportation. It received a large number of contracts from various parts of the world and became popular for space missions because of the reliability at an affordable price. In 2015, SpaceX achieved a successful landing and recovery of the first stage of a Falcon 9 rocket. This was the first time SpaceX was able to recover any used part of a rocket. In 2019, SpaceX launched the first Starlink mission. Starlink is a project by SpaceX in which they are going to form a constellation of satellites around the Earth to provide access of internet anywhere on the planet. But in 2020, SpaceX achieved their biggest milestone. On 30th May 2020, SpaceX launched 2 NASA astronauts to the International Space Station. This made SpaceX the first and the only private company till date to launch humans successfully into space. SpaceX is now developing the Starship, which will make them able to send missions to the Mars and the Moon. SpaceX currently has 2 operational rockets, the Falcon 9 and the Falcon Heavy. Currently, SpaceX's valuation is about $74 billion. Their achievements have shown us that nothing is impossible. Making a reusable rocket was one time thought to be impossible by the major space agencies, but today that has been made a reality by SpaceX on its own. An important thing to learn from Elon Musk and SpaceX is that if you have the determination and the willpower to do something, then it will become a reality one day. Just don't lose hope and don't ever think about quitting. Just go on trying hard. You will achieve success. If you like today's video, then make sure to subscribe. This is the return you can give me from your side for the amazing content every week. Make sure to watch my other videos.